U.S. President's also been busy trying to spur a global recovery. Obama vowing stronger financial regulation. He's due to unveil the biggest overhaul since the Great Depression. My colleague Al Hunt asked the president how his proposals will protect people from yet another crisis.
There are a series of components to it. Number one, we're going to make sure that we've got a systemic regulator, somebody who can oversee the entire system, and when you start seeing the kinds of risks that we saw being taken in this last crisis, that we can catch it before the crisis occurs. We're going to make sure that we are regulating the non-bank sector as well as the bank sector. So the huge growth in the securitization markets, that has been a major source of problems, and we're going to make sure that there aren't any gaps in coverage. Consumers and investors, we've got to make sure that we have somebody who is focused and responsible for protecting consumers, whether it's on subprime loans for their mortgages, for their credit cards, that investors have additional protections. And the problem is right now you've got consumers and investors whose the agencies that are responsible also have responsibilities for the integrity of the institution. So you've got divided attention. We want to make sure that we've got consolidated focus on consumer and investor protection.
But when you talk about consolidation, you had, during the campaign, I remember, said the financial system was plagued by competing financial regulatory agencies. Yet under your plan, there's still going to be more than a half dozen. Did those competing interests stifle reform?
No, we're still going to have some significant consolidation, but we always understood that we were going to have to build off of a foundation that already existed. It didn't make sense for us to create a whole new SEC when the SEC already has some top-notch professionals who do what they do very well. But what you're still going to see is some agencies are going to be eliminated. In some cases, some of their functions are going to be taken out of that particular agency and put into another. The goal is to integrate the system, make sure that there are not any gaps, and to make sure that we have a updating of the regulatory system that worked back in the 1930s but doesn't work with the kinds of financial instruments and the kinds of global capital markets that exist today. And we're confident that we've struck the right balance.
One of those instruments is something called derivatives.
Right.
Now, you're going to regulate some or oversee some, but most of the complex ones will still be traded privately. Why shouldn't all trades in this multi-trillion-dollar market, which cause such problems, why shouldn't it be publicly regulated on exchanges?
Well, I don't want to completely step on my story for tomorrow when I announce the details of our plan. But let me say this. Derivatives are a huge potential risk to the system. We are going to make sure that they have to register, that they are regulated, that you have clearing houses so that everybody knows what people's various positions are. Right now, you've got an entire shadow system of enormous risk. That's all going to be brought to the surface, and we believe that transparency and openness is the key step in making sure that they're not posing a risk to the system as a whole.
You give greater power to the Federal Reserve, which failed to spot troubles at Citi and Bank of America. Despite that, does that indicate you have full confidence in Ben Bernanke?
Well, first of all, I think Ben Bernanke has done an extraordinary job under extraordinary circumstances. Point number two is we have to have somebody who is responsible for seeing the risks of the system as a whole and not just individual institutions. And we think that the Fed is best positioned to do that. Now, it already has some of that power, but it doesn't have all of it. The other thing that it's lacking right now is the resolution authority, so that when a single institution like an AIG breaks down or a bank holding company breaks down, there's an ability to unwind that individual institution without bringing down the entire system as a whole. And so in some cases we're expanding modestly the Fed's powers. In other circumstances we're actually going to relieve them of some responsibilities, for example on the consumer side, as I just discussed, so that somebody has line responsibility just to focus on making sure that consumers are protected.
Okay, so the president's speaking of consolidation, but this Consumer Protection Agency going to be a new baby here. Paul Sheard in Tokyo, you heard all that from the president. What was your main takeaway?
Well, I think the interesting thing is that that the administration is actually moving quite fast on this issue. They're not waiting for all of the extraordinary measures to be unwound and for the economy to get back on track before they address the issue. So I think that's point number one. The other thing that I think that comes across is that, you know, there is really no easy way out here. There's no perfect solution. There's no silver bullet. But I think some lessons have been learned. They've been learned in the marketplace and they've been learned in the regulatory sphere as well. And they'll have to be put to use. But the idea that somehow the landscape can be withdrawn, some regulations put in place, and we don't have to worry about this issue again, that obviously is not the case.
You do risk going back to the old boring days, you know, when America was on the, much of the world was on the gold standard. Banks were told what they had to borrow at and what they could lend at. I mean, are we headed down that road?
I don't think so. I think they'll be sensible enough not to try to micromanage the system. But, you know, getting back to the systemic issue, which I think is the key one here, coming into this crisis, there was no real lender of last resort facility for the capital markets in the US. There was no equivalent of the FDIC, for example, what that does for the banking system. Now, the Fed has relied on a very arcane section of the Federal Reserve Act, 13.3, which is kind of like a lender of last resort facility, but it's not really structured that way. And the Fed, in fact, has interpreted that in a very, very narrow fashion. So I think that issue has to be sorted out. What do you do when you get a run on the capital markets?
Okay, Paul, we're going to talk about human capital next in the show, and AC.
What you've seen is that the pace of job loss has slowed. And I think that the economy is going to turn around. But as you know, jobs are a lagging indicator. And we've got to produce 150,000 jobs every month just to keep pace.
Prudent Mr. Obama, they're kind of echoing what many have been harping on about. It's not that things are great, it's just that they're not as rotten as they used to be, so less rotten than before. The president's saying unemployment easily going to hit the 10% level, kind of traditional French level, if you will, even as the economy begins to emerge from recession. Here in Hong Kong, the jobless rate remaining at a three-year high, around 5.3%, but for the first time since the crisis erupted, stabilizing. That might be a good sign. There are jobs out there, but the payback is thinning. In their 09 workplace survey, HR consultancy Robert Half found that starting salaries are down 10, maybe 20%, maybe even more than that in some special cases. We're joined on the show by Andrew Morris, the Hong Kong director for Robert Half, and of course our friend Paul Sheard, global chief economist at Nomura Securities, remains with us from Tokyo. Hello, Andrew.
G'day, Bernie. How you
going? What are employers doing? They're taking advantage of the mess out there and basically saying, okay, you are going to work overtime with no pay. You're going to work 7 days, 365 days a year, 24/7, and we're going to cut your pay by 20%. That is not very nice, is it?
No, they're not quite dropping their pay by 20%. I suppose the people who are more vulnerable in regards to pay cuts are those who have been made redundant and who are looking for work now. So when they're trying to re-enter the market, they're certainly taking significant pay cuts. People who are actually in jobs still, they're not necessarily taking pay cuts, certainly getting paid a lot less on bonuses, but salaries for people who are in jobs at the moment are certainly being far more steady than they were before.
It would appear, just looking at the latest several streams of data, that we're not going to be getting, you know, half a percentage point increases in the jobless rate in most of these economies of which we speak. It may creep up a little bit slowly, very, very fractionally, but the worst crash is probably over for now. Are those the kind of trend lines that you're seeing?
Yeah, look, it appears so. We're certainly seeing growth now in the financial services sector for the first time, I'd say, over the last 60 days. We're seeing some of the bigger financial institutions that are actually rehiring again, and there are certainly roles in the back office, as in risk, compliance and audit, and we're also now seeing some operational middle office positions within financial services institutions. Certainly it's still tough times in the manufacturing sector. There certainly aren't as many opportunities there, but you know, the economy does seem to be showing signs of recovery here. We're also seeing signs of, you know, extra roles in the contracting sector. So there's certainly roles in process improvement, transformation, and those types of opportunities for people either in jobs today, in contract roles, or people who are now looking for opportunities.
The fact that so people are taking contract roles without the traditional accoutrements or traditional perks that go along with the job. This is mostly cost containment. What does it mean to the structure of the workforce? Do we have more businesses moving toward that kind of a flexi model? Is this sort of here to stay?
I think so. I think contracting in Hong Kong compared to other places around the world is still new. The concept of contracting in this country is becoming quite relevant, where people are certainly trying to reduce costs off their fixed line and put them onto their variable line. I think people are, I suppose, managers within the workforce at the moment are wary about putting people on permanently and then not knowing if they're going to be redundant in the next 6 months. So I think it's companies being cautious re-entering the market and making sure that people have opportunities moving forward, but to not put them into a position where they could start a role and in 6 to 12 months then
and there are growth industries out there, auditing, anything having to do with the forensic accounting. The lawyers are probably having a field day right now, right?
Well, look, it's certainly in transformation or process improvement, anywhere where you can obviously make their business run more efficiently and cost-effective.
Okay, so robotization and basically cutting down on the fat but keeping the muscle, to use an old cliche. Paul Sheard, let me bring you into this conversation. I had an interesting graph that was sent to me by a viewer on my morning show, my morning call, today, that was very, very telling. I didn't audit it, and I couldn't confirm it, so I'm not going to put it on here. But in a nutshell, what it seemed to reflect is that after a recession, you don't get the same sort of human capital buildup that you did previously. The process improvement, which Andrew was talking about here, is here to stay, and people find new ways to squeeze more from 11. And it was a steady downhill sort of a trajectory over recession after recession, going way, way, way back in the annals of history. Is there some credence? Is there some credibility to that kind of phenomenon?
Well, Bernie, not having actually seen the chart, not too confident in answering that question, but certainly the labour market is a very important part of any recession story, and it was mentioned before that unemployment tends to sort of rise and peak late into the recession cycle, and even when the recovery is going, unemployment is very slow to come down. The healing process in the labour market's very slow. I think what that also means is that corporations coming out of a recession, and certainly coming out of this recession with the additional bells and whistles of a financial crisis, are going to be very uncertain about the 1 to 2 year horizon. So they're going to be uncertain not just about putting people on, but also investing in that human capital. So I wouldn't be surprised if something along the lines of what you're suggesting is evident in the data.
What's going to happen down the line, Andrew? I mean, you remember, when you and I were in school, you're in your 30s, I think. Yeah. I'm actually in my 40s. You had to get a BA. If you had a bachelor's degree, you were on top of the world. You were the cream of the crop. You were at the top. You were the chosen ones. And then it became a master's. You really needed an MBA a decade and a half or 20 years ago. I mean, are we going to see a new legion of overeducated people who are underemployed? And what kind of an infrastructure is that going to create around the globe?
Certainly, look, when I was into the work for myself back in the late 90s, early 2000s, there were many people. You
were only in the workforce in the late 90s?
Still a young man. Still a young man, Bernie. And,
why am I listening to you? No, go on.
What I was finding, back then is there are a lot of people who are very highly educated, and it was tough to find a job. So I think over the next 1 to 2 years, people coming out of university certainly will find it tough, and the people at university or coming out with results really need to be in the top 1% to be successful over the next 12 months. So we certainly will find a high percentage of younger people striving to find their first role.
You mentioned that the process improvement industries, those kind of lubricate efficiencies are in vogue. Does that mean that this whole trade thing, the engineers, those who make things, operations, control and management, that sort of thing, it's really going to be passé, very, very last generation, or is it going to bounce back, do you think?
I think it'll bounce back. I think things are starting to show signs of green shoots, as you were talking about a little bit earlier in the program.
Everybody's talking about green shoots.
Absolutely.
Anyway.
So the roles were there 100 years ago. The roles will be here 100 years to come. It's just obviously a phase of what the economy is going through. There's obviously restructuring in many organisations, and I see moving forward that a lot of these roles that may have been put on the back burner will be certainly coming to the forefront in the next 6 to 12 months.
Okay, good talking to you, young whippersnapper. Okay, we'll chat again
Thanks,
soon.
Bernie.
Andrew Morris, Robert Half.